All right, we are now live. Great.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Warren.
Good morning.
Everyone.
So glad the internet is working this week.
Yes.
Actually, Sam, I had a power outage for like 5 hours here. My sister, I was out of town, but my sister was like, we don't have electricity. There's no internet. So I don't know. I guess it's just being passed around like city to city or something.
Yeah, right. Mhm. So we're going to talk about those outages today and special measures, which we have to have our own special measures program, Jules, for when we have an outage. So definitely.
Perfect timing for Warren to be here.
Hi, Sumit.
Hi, Shar. How are you doing?
Good to see you in person.
Likewise, Shar.
So I know we're about to get started in about 2 minutes, and so we start have some people joining us right now. So we're going to get started in just a moment. But yeah, so Jules and Shar, I know you guys you went to a ball game. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. Went to the All-Star game yesterday. It was really fun here in Denver, and it was a blast. We're close to the field. So yeah, it was a late night.
Well, I actually didn't get to go to the game. I was emceeing for one of the sponsors, Chevy. So I was like in a little display using my voice all week, getting everyone excited and, just getting the crowd, like into all the things in the display. So, but it was good. It was like it was weird seeing so many, like such a big crowd, but also really good. I think people are just so happy to be out doing stuff. So it was,
yeah, the fraction of the population were in their masks still, so, but yeah, I got video of all the people, It's like,
yeah.
No. Of course, I'm the one people watching,
why not,
Yeah, Bruce is the one literally paying attention to the game, and I'm like trying to hold this big old hot dog without spilling it all over myself. No, it was good.
Well, great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We can go ahead and kick things off here. So let me share there. And so as we get started, I just had to once again apologize everybody for the internet outage last week. And so hopefully we're going to recuperate. We're going to have our speaker from last week, Patty Money, join us next week. And so we'll go through that in a minute. So Jules, you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad we could actually get together because, yeah, last week, I'm so sorry if you hopped in and we're like, where is everyone? But we're back, and I want to officially welcome you to the People Strategies Forum. It's really exciting because I'm seeing some new faces on here. I have some new names, so welcome. Just to give you a rundown of what this is and what happens, we get together every week, and this is really a mastermind of leaders, and we're dedicated to creating workplaces where people are going to thrive, where employers reward and customers love. So each and every week, we talk about a different topic. It's really conversational. We have a guest speaker each and every week, and we really encourage you to get interactive with us. Put any comments in the chat. Definitely any questions you have, put them in the chat as well, because we want to guide the conversation and cater it towards everything that you are wanting to learn about. And to introduce myself, my name is Jules. I help host the forum, and I will be in the corner looking for your questions throughout the session today. And I'm going to also introduce you to my lovely panel here. We got a nice full house, which is great. I'm going to introduce Shar. She has over 20 years of HR experience, and she's transitioned from not just being an HR expert, a talent management consultant, but a founder of her own company as well. Sumit, who we haven't seen for a while, we're so happy he's back and healthy. He is also a people strategist, HR expert, HR consultant, has over 16 years of experience across various industries. And we're just so happy to have you back. It's so great to see your face. And Sam is really the reason we get together every week. He brings the forum together. He is also the founder and CEO of Comp Team, and they're a company that helps with compensation programs, talent initiatives. So this will actually, I think this conversation will be really in Sam's wheelhouse today as well. And then I'm going to introduce our lovely guest for today. So we have Warren Heaps, and Warren is located in New York City. He has over 35 years of experience as an international compensation expert, salary survey provider in over 165 countries. We had it wrong in the beginning. It was like 148, but now it's grown to 165. So that's really exciting. He has worked with Colgate and Palmolive, and now he has been working with the Birches Group for the past 15 years, and they have a special focus on developing markets. So we're really excited to have Warren here. He is going to be talking to us about how to manage compensation when uncontrollable events occur, and what has happened in the past year, something completely out of our control. And we're not just talking about pandemics. It can be a range of things. Warren mentioned even something as like a smaller event like a flood. So there's different things that can happen, and we can't wait to hear what he has to share with us today and the special measures we can take. So welcome, Warren, to the forum.
Yeah,
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So Warren, I know that first I just like to dive in and just learn a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? I mean, how did you get involved in compensation and especially those international markets? And how did you get involved with Birches Group? So if you could kind of walk us through that story.
So like most compensation experts, I did not study compensation in college. I was a math major looking for a job that didn't involve teaching. And I ended up answering a blind box number for a company called TPF&C, which is now Willis Towers Watson, as a benefits analyst. And they had an impressive list of clients, all Fortune 500 companies I had heard of. And I said, yeah, okay. They have really nice offices, really, really thick carpeting, quite the luxurious setup. And so I started as a benefits analyst. Then I moved to Colgate in 1987. Spent 20 years there, starting in benefits. Then I moved into international compensation, which was really expatriate compensation. I didn't really know anything about compensation before that moment, but I really liked it, so I stayed with it. And then I took a job with Colgate supporting their Latin America division for a while. And then I did a special project to restructure domestic HR and put in shared services and SAP before SAP was a common household term. And then I went back into the international comp world as the director of international comp for my last 10 years at Colgate, managing local compensation and executive compensation and their expatriate program in about 70 countries. I joined Birches Group because, well, you know how things are. My boss retired, her boss retired. The new folks that came in weren't, say, to my liking. And I had a really bad week, and I met my current managing partner, Gary McGillicuddy, for lunch, and he said, well, you should really come join us. And I said, yeah, really? And 7 months later, we signed the papers. But I had met my colleagues from Birches Group during a period when they were operating as the global consulting service of the UNDP, which is the field arm of the UN system.
Yeah.
I had no idea that people in the UN did salary surveys. To this day, they still do, by the way. And so a lot of the work that we started with in Birches Group came out of the experience of my partners for 25 years in UNDP. So the company really wasn't spun off from UNDP. It was more everybody sort of retired or quit and started the company. And so today we're an organization of about 125 people, mostly based in the Philippines, in Manila, 5 partners in the US and in Europe. And we serve clients, multinational companies, international organizations, embassies, development banks, and NGOs. specializing in compensation and benefits matters in developing countries. And when I say developing, think the smallest places in the world that you can think of, and we probably have a survey there.
I know. I mean, you're a great resource for me, Warren, because there's when I work with a lot of companies, and I do have a location in an emerging part of the world or a developing part of the world. I know that you're always a great resource to where I can get information on how do we look at their pay market. So it's great. So just a back up a bit. So during today's discussion, we're going to be talking about putting together a special measures policy, or what that looks like, and what that is that when there is a particular situation or a calamity in the world, like Jules mentioned, a pandemic or a currency devaluation or hyperinflation, that there's a way that the company knows how they're going to address those particular issues. So it is important to mention that during this call, our session here, if you have any questions, please use the chat if you're on the Zoom platform. And if we are broadcasting across a lot of different social media channels, such as LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube and Twitter. So feel free to leave your questions there, and we'll get to those after the session. So to start off with, Warren, can you kind of dive into a little bit more details around, what type of companies should be concerned about having a special measures type plan in place?
Well, the organizations that we usually work with are those that are operating in the dusty places of the world. Developing countries tend to have a lot more economic instability than the developed world. They also have sometimes weaker infrastructure. So if a natural disaster occurs, like a typhoon, it sometimes it's much more impactful in a developing country than it is in a developed country. I mean, putting aside situations like Katrina, which obviously was very devastating here in the United States, there are Katrina-like events all over the world every year, sometimes multiple times. But the most common thing we see is economic instability, maxi devaluations, hyperinflation, and those sorts of circumstances. And as it relates to our compensation colleagues, one of the most often asked questions we get is, well, there was a devaluation of 15%, what should I do? And the answer is, well, you don't need to do very much for that. But if it's truly a maxi devaluation, 40 or 50%, or 500%, like what happened in Sudan in February, then you probably need to do something. And the question is, well, what should I do? And what usually happens is when an event like this occurs, the first thing you do is you ask everybody around you, well, what are you doing? So it's sort of like you could call a meeting of all the local HR people in a country, and they'll be sitting around the table saying, well, what are you going to do about the problem? Well, I don't know. What are you doing? And you just sort of look at each other and stare and say, well, nobody knows what to do. We're all waiting to see what everybody else does. That doesn't work very well, because your employees are going to naturally come to you and say, hey, there's this thing that happened, and now the economy is in upheaval. How are you going to help me make sure that I can put food on the table for my family?
Right.
And they're going to ask everybody they can ask, so they're going to ask their boss, because it's a natural thing to do. And the answer they're looking for is, of course we'll help you.
Yeah.
And most managers want to say that.
Yeah. So one thing, Warren, I mean, the big issue though is having a plan like this, or a plan of attack on how to address these issues, really can create a strategic advantage between your company and others, right? I mean, you're on top of things, you're ready to go, you're treating your talent right, and so forth. So sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's a critical point of, since we're here on a talent management and strategy type forum, this is something that can create a strategic advantage.
No, you're absolutely right, Sam. That's the whole point. The whole point of having the answer is you need to have a policy. You need to think about the stuff now before it happens and decide what is it you're prepared to do. And let people know, let your employees know, let your managers know, if this happens, do this. And it becomes automatic. And so that gives you a tremendous competitive advantage because you're going to be leading the market. When you go into that conference room to talk with your peer companies about how are you dealing with the crisis, you're going to be the one in the room that says, here's what we're doing.
Mhm.
And they're going to look at you and say, oh, how did you figure that out? We figured it out 3 years ago. We
Well,
spent
I
some
think
time
it's super
thinking
fa-
about it.
Yeah, it's very, my company very much values transparency. And so during our crisis, now granted we are in America, but our employees appreciate that we're very transparent, honest, forthright. They knew that I had a partner like Sam and comp team supporting me as well, so that they knew what was going on during the epidemic and crisis when we had to shut down our locations and how we were going to be able to pay our employees. And we were successful at that. But also during that time, I was spending a lot of time in developing countries like Belize, a little teeny island.
We have a survey there.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating because, you know, you're talking everyone's driving golf carts in the dirt, you know, and but there's a lot of infrastructure being built, a lot of American or North America type countries coming in and, you know, building new buildings. And I noticed like certain times construction would stop because of shortage of labor or shortage of the materials because they were on an island. And I spent a lot of time talking to the owners of these locations saying, how do you deal with that when your employees are, this is all they have to feed their families, or you know, or do they have the health benefits if someone gets work on a construction site? So I think it's really good that you offer this service.
Yeah, and so let's just dive into a little bit more detail about who really is in need of this, because there's different situations, and I think there's a lot of our listeners out there that are wondering, well, is this something that is for a big company, or is this something that I need, you know, here in the United States or whatever? So let's talk about a few examples. I mean, we the major situations you're talking about in Africa, where there's massive devaluation, or in some areas where there's hyperinflation, and then there's other things that happen, such as, you know, fires in California. I mean, we, of course, the pandemic. We're looking at supply chain shortages, which is impeding people for doing their work. I mean, when some of this comes into business interruption, and some comes into how our people are impacted. So what should we be looking at there, Warren?
And there's also civil unrest and you know, like the assassination of a president, for example.
Yeah.
And that just happened earlier this week in Haiti.
Right.
So yeah, there's all kinds of scenarios. I guess you know, you mentioned business interruption, and you know, most major companies have contingency plans already in place for, you know, when business gets interrupted. And I think for the most part, those that had those plans, you know, utilized them pretty effectively during the pandemic here, at least in the US. The kinds of situations that we normally work with our clients on, again, these are clients who are operating in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, in places where the infrastructure is weak in many cases, and the economic volatility is very profound. And what we find is that the advantage of having a policy is that you know up front what you're going to do, and again, from a compensation perspective. And so it's really the economic devaluation, inflation type events that are most prominently featured. The economic events that occur are the ones that oftentimes companies really struggle with, you know, how do we react to this? What should we do? If there's a 10% or 15% devaluation of the local currency versus US dollars, do you need to do anything? We would actually argue, no, probably not. You need to make sure you're paying competitively to begin with, and maybe monitor the market and see what happens. But fundamentally, you know, as any comp professional knows, you're supposed to be using cost of labor as a basis for salaries. And cost of labor, cost of living, and devaluation are, believe it or not correlated. People think they are, employees think they are, here's an example that I like to share because it illustrates my point perfectly. On May 1st, 2012, the Malawian kwacha devalued by 47%. Now that arguably is a maxi devaluation event, and so would be worthy of consideration of implementing special measures, some sort of extra compensation in order to help tide people over. Now, some clients on that day said, well, we are just going to switch our salaries to US dollars because it'll be much easier. So they did that. Well, if they did that, and they kept it in place for, say, about 4 years till around March of 2016, then they would have essentially delivered in local currency equivalent in Malawi a 400% increase over less than 4 years. And that's without giving anyone a pay increase. That's just the dollar amount translated according to devaluation. Now you might say, that doesn't sound unreasonable. I'm sure the market went up during that period, and it did by 125%. Oops, I'm a little bit ahead now. And during that same period, inflation was measured at only 85%. So they're not related. People think they are, but they're not. Another question you could ask in deciding, well, how much of a response should I make because of this economic event? Well, suppose I had two companies, both targeting the 50th percentile of the market. One had salaries that are hovering around the 25th percentile, and one was right on target at the 50th percentile. Should those two companies have the same reaction to this devaluation event? I would argue that the one that's behind the market might want to be more aggressive than the one that's on target. So knowing whether you're close to your target is a really important fact. And a lot of companies don't really know that.
So before we go on, Warren, I'd like to kind of go back to the you mentioned as far as changing the currency, and when a pay or the currency in a particular country, I mean, it can be becomes unstable or is going through crisis. There is a desire to switch to a more stable currency. In this case, in your example, was US dollars. And so what are, and that can be very tempting, but and you mentioned one of the pitfalls was that the dollar could appreciate a lot faster than what their local economy is, causing you to potentially overpay in that area. But what are the other consequences that are happening? I mean, within the company, consequences to the company, and also consequences to the local labor market.
So there's a lot of consequences. One of the ones that we see most often is that once you switch, you can never switch back.
And why is that?
It's just too hard. Employees won't accept it. They'll say you're cutting my pay. They'll try and claim acquired rights rules, and that's actually one of the tricky parts about doing this. I mean, if you were to denominate your salaries in dollars and pay in local currency, and the currency revalues, that is, gets stronger against the dollar, so you get less local currency. In some countries, employees could make a claim that because of acquired rights rules, you can't cut my pay. You can only give me more. You can never give me less. Now, in some countries, if you have a contract that specifies dollars, then that wouldn't be the case, like in Colombia. But in some countries, you can't have a contract in dollars, and so it's going to be a problem. The long-term effect of some employers dollarizing and some employers not dollarizing is a bifurcated market, particularly among higher-level professional jobs. A good example of that is Mozambique. Mozambique went through a bad period in the late 1990s. The currency became worthless. Most international employers pulled out. The ones that remained, which were mostly embassies, World Bank, UN, and some NGOs, converted to dollars because the Medi-Cal was worthless. So basically the currency stopped functioning as a currency. 2003, the government was restored, things were better, the mining companies came back in, the banks came back in, more NGOs came in, and we got a very, very strange phone call a couple of years back from a mining company, which as a natural resource company tend to be good payers in the market. And they said, we can't compete with the NGOs. We said, you're crazy. We work with a lot of NGOs. They're mostly nonprofits. They're generally not paying that high a salary, certainly not as high as a mining company or an oil company. And they say, no, 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 they're all paying in dollars. So it turns out that that group of NGOs that stayed during the crisis and dollarized hadn't been able to switch back. And there was now a 1 million Medi-Cal difference between the salaries they were paying for senior level professional managers and technical specialists and what the rest of the market was offering, even among private sector companies. So it's disruptive on a long-term basis to the local economy, because what you're going to end up with is essentially a market within a market.
I see.
And another example is just kind of knowing where you're recruiting your people from. We had a question raised recently in Ethiopia from one of our clients who was trying to hire a country director, and they had we had built their salary structure for them. They were anchored pretty clearly to the right market, and the going rate for a country director was around $45,000 equivalent, $45,000. And they said, well, we found great candidates, but all the candidates we found had an expectation around $90,000. And it turns out that only half the organizations in our survey had local country directors. The rest of them had expat country directors. And that was another example of knowing your market. In that case, they were attracting people from the expat community, and so their salary expectations were international in scope rather than local in scope. But that's kind of unrelated, I guess, to special measures. The important point about dollarization is that essentially you're yielding control of usually your largest expense to the whims of the government by dollarizing. And what I mean by that is exchange rates are not totally market driven. They're also controlled by governments at various times, and sometimes intergovernmental organizations like the IMF intervene and say to a government, which is exactly what happened in Malawi, it's exactly what happened in Sudan in February of this year. The IMF suggests strongly that they close the gap between the official rate and the black market rate in that country, and all of a sudden there's a maxi devaluation. Now, if your salary line is tied to dollars, your local currency costs are going to go up dramatically, and you have no control over it. And as the Malawi example illustrates, sometimes devaluation exceeds market movement. This has also been historically true in countries like Argentina. And the reason is because businesses can't afford it. They can't afford to match the devaluation. What they're matching is the cost of labor. So all this to say, you need to have a policy. It needs to be well thought out and documented and communicated. And one of the key issues that compensation people like to be able to say is that their compensation program is market driven. And the approach that we take in developing these special measures policies allows companies to maintain a market relationship and move things in drips and drabs, but to lead the market in terms of being responsive to the crisis.
Right. Well, that brings up one thing that's going on right now, that just more and more there's the ability of being able to work remotely as a knowledge worker. And so in some situations, if there's a calamity in one particular area, and let's say that they're displaced and they need to flee perhaps the country to go to another country. Well, I've seen a lot of companies just think, oh, well, that's not a problem. They work off a computer. They can just go to this European country and start working there, and all's fine. What kind of problems do you see with that thinking?
There's a number of problems. Are they fleeing to this country at their own expense? Do they have a place to stay? Are they staying in a hotel? Are they staying with relatives? Are your corporate tax folks going to be satisfied that you're not establishing a permanent establishment by having employees in this market without having a registered entity? And let's just suffice to say that if you know what PE is, great. If you don't know what it is, ask your corporate tax people to explain it to you. And it's something that you generally want to avoid unless you have an entity, because it causes really, let's just say really, really bad corporate tax outcomes. What market are you compensating this person against? I mean, if somebody, flees from Angola to Nigeria, are you going to pay them like an Angolan? Or are you going to pay them like a Nigerian? Or are you going to pay them some other way? These are hard questions to ask. And obviously, you could say, well, for the first X number of months during the crisis, we're just going to maintain the status quo. But what if it goes longer than that?
Yeah.
What if the pandemic lasts more than 3 months?
Right.
Then what do you do? And not to say not even to get into, well, what happens when things get back to normal and people still want to work remotely? That's a subject for a whole nother webinar.
That's great. That's right. So tell us, Warren, so for companies to start thinking ahead, they've established that okay, this could be something that we need. We are reaching out into areas to where that are more unstable. Perhaps there could be some instability in our current location, and so we need a policy. What are the steps that need to happen in this process?
Well, of course, you can develop this policy on your own, or you can work with a consultant. If you choose to work with a consultant, I know one. But when we work with clients on these projects, what we normally see is that first, we advise the client that they should form a cross-functional team, HR, compensation, finance, and sometimes people from security or business continuity, people who are responsible in the organization for those kinds of things. And then we have a series of pretty comprehensive conversations, typically 3 one-hour sessions usually, where we go through a laundry list of possible things for the policy to cover, types of events. We share best practices. We talk to them and ask them questions about how they reacted to these situations in the past. Kind of get a temperature of what kind of organization they are and how they react and how generous or not generous they want to be. Also how policy driven they might be and what policies they might already have in place that could overlap. We get into a fair amount of detail about triggers. For the economic events, it's very, very difficult actually to define what the right trigger is, because there's a lot of debate about it.
So tell us what is a trigger?
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So let's suppose that you decide that hyperinflation is one of the things you want to cover under your special measures policy. Okay, well, forgetting about what the technical definition of hyperinflation is, how much inflation is enough for the special measures policy to take effect? And if you ask employees or even managers, most of them will say, well, anything in the double digits, that's pretty bad, because they're using the US or Europe as a basis for that. Well, I would argue that double digits doesn't cut it. 40, 50% is more like it. 40 or 50%, well, it doesn't happen in many places. That's true. These are truly crisis situations, not ordinary situations. So one of the things we try and educate our clients about is the difference between chronically high inflation. I have 20% inflation in this country every year. There's ways to deal with that which don't require special measures. It requires a modification to your normal compensation, maybe having 2 increases a year instead of 1, for example. Mm-hmm. But when a country is kind of going along normally and all of a sudden there's a spike to 40% in 1 month, that's a crisis. That's going to have profound economic impact on your staff, and they're going to look to you to do something about it. The most common question you'll get is, well, my salary was worth 100 last month and now it's only worth 60. Aren't you going to make up the difference? And the answer is probably no, you're not going to make up the difference, but you should do something. So what we're trying to nail down is, well, what should the something be? And you should do a portion of it. So we talk about how to define those triggers, whether it's 40% or 50% or 40% in 1 month or accumulation over 3 months of some number that's 25% a month for 3 months. You can define those triggers however you want, essentially, but we kind of guide you to go high. Then you need to look at sources of data to be able to effectively and objectively measure those triggers. And devaluation data is pretty easy to come by because there's published sources of exchange rates every day, even every minute. Inflation, not so much. Inflation statistics are often published by governments every month. They're also published and accumulated by international organizations such as the World Bank and the UN and the International Monetary Fund, and OECD, and organizations like that. And also universities and countries have departments that keep track of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The government sourced data is oftentimes not the best data.
And why is that?
It's subject to corruption and things like that, but also just understand in general how CPIs work, right? Consumer price indices. A consumer price index measures a market basket of goods, and that market basket of goods and services is defined by each government entity differently. In each country has their own market basket. For example, in Japan, there's probably less meat and more fish in the market basket than there is in the US. Well, in a developing country in Africa, a big component of that market basket is going to be rice and staple items that are really targeted to the lowest socioeconomic class in the country. And so the measure of inflation from those statistics is going to be based on the people living, in near the poverty line in rural areas, or in very overcrowded situations in the city, not necessarily people working for multinational companies who have been college educated. Again, every country, no matter how poor they are, has a middle class and an elite class. And those are probably a lot of the people who are working for multinational companies, and they're experiencing life very differently from the way the government is assuming they are. So those inflation statistics from the government are probably not very accurate for your workforce, first of all.
But one other thing though, Warren, is I noticed when looking at different economic statistics from like as you mentioned, government sources, World Bank, different things like this, I often see significantly different numbers. How does a company wrangle these different things or make sense of it?
All of the sources have pluses and minuses. If you can find multiple sources and look at an average, that helps to lessen the differences or to understand why there's differences and where they're sourcing their data from. One of the biggest challenges, though, with inflation data is that it tends to lag the market by about 6 months. That is, publicly available, published data on inflation rates tends to be about 6 months old. In order to get more current information, you have to buy it, and it's very expensive. Mm-hmm. In the hundreds of thousands. If you were to get a subscription to, say, the EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is one of the most common sources. Now, a lot of the big consulting firms and corporations simply just have a subscription to EIU data, and so they can use that for business planning, they can use it for currency hedging, they can use it for all kinds of things. We worked with a major beverage company on their special measures policy, and when we got to the question about inflation and devaluation information, they said, oh, our corporate finance department has this. So that's what they're using. It was very easy. Then we worked with a small NGO that did not have the budget to have a corporate treasury department that was so well versed in currency hedging. And we worked with them to find a credible source, let's say. And there are some that are not too expensive or even free. But it's just one of the things to keep in mind that when you start trying to define this, you oftentimes will run into disagreements, even among the people on the committee, about, well, what constitutes a crisis? How much is, I think anything over 10% is high. I think over 50%, how do you compromise? So it often is helpful to have a third party to sort of guide that conversation.
So it sounds like it's a combination of understanding what the company wants to do from a talent perspective. What is their
Mhm.
talent philosophy? What is their pay philosophy? And how does that come together in
Right.
this, and how do we react with the special measures?
Right. And most companies that we work with have a market-driven compensation policy. That is, they want to use cost of labor. They want to be competitive. They don't want to go overboard. And so how do you apply special measures in these unique situations and still be market-driven?
Mm-hmm.
And there are, the way you do it is slowly. You don't, if there's a 50% devaluation, you don't increase people's pay by 50%.
Yeah.
That's a little bit overboard. That's a lot overboard.
So Warren, tell us a story about a situation where a company has put in a policy like this, and they've seen it go into action, and in a positive way.
For most of the clients that we've worked with, they've found the policies work. What it allows, so if you have a policy in place and one of these events occurs, and you follow our guidance, which is that you don't really require very much more than one approval. That is, somebody needs to certify that the trigger has been triggered. And no, there are no further approvals at that moment in time, right? So if you have a trigger that says, if there's 40% inflation, we're going to do this. And then the local country office, sends it up to the appropriate person at the regional level or corporate headquarters and says, the trigger was triggered. And so we're going to kick the special measures policy into effect. Then what happens is on the next payroll, those employees are going to receive an increase in accordance with the policy. The effect of that is, number one, it provides employees with something. It indicates that the company is helping them, that they've heard the requests, because no doubt they've gotten requests. It's also going to put your company ahead of the market, because most employers don't have these policies and are going to have to spend at least 6 or 8 weeks getting approvals to do something. It's going to enable you to monitor your market position in an enhanced way, because you've now enhanced your salaries. So we were comfortable where we were before, but now we're comfortable. We're sort of leading the market, not necessarily being totally ahead of the market, but being a leader in terms of being responsive to the crisis. And then over time, as the other employers in the market get on board and do something, because they almost always will, the survey data is going to capture that and allow you to refine your position so that you don't go too far. Mm-hmm. One of the big challenges of making big increases is that in most countries outside the US, you can never reduce pay. Again, acquired rights. So our approach, mindful of those restrictions, tends to dole out increases in smaller doses, so that there's a very, very small likelihood that the market would ever exceed what you've done. You might need to catch up a little bit, but you're probably not going to have to cut back, which is the place that you want to be in. You don't want to be so far ahead that you're overcompensating, but you want to be able to be first so that you're responsive to the situation. And then you want to be market competitive on an ongoing basis.
So it sounds like some of the guidance that you're mentioning is it's important to have one of these processes or these plans in place, but it's also important not to overreact. I mean, we should be looking at, sometimes there can be volatility in a particular market, and it can go up significantly, it can come back significantly as well. So there needs to be some careful thought there. What other types of considerations or downsides do companies need to be aware of in implementing a policy such as this?
I think there can be strong disagreements around inflation versus devaluation. Mm-hmm. A lot of times employees will focus on devaluation because they somehow equate their salary to dollars and say, well, you're paying me in pesos, but it's $50,000 and now it's only 43,000, so I'm losing money. But are they really losing money? Because they're living in the local market. And so if there's devaluation and prices are set in pesos for locally produced goods, there's not much of an impact. Now for imported goods, including locally produced goods that rely on imported raw materials, there is an impact. And so some would believe that focusing on the inflation number without respect to devaluation is really the way to go, because typically if there's a big devaluation, then inflation follows. And to the extent that inflation impacts the country is going to be largely dependent on what's imported, and particularly if it's oil and food versus other things. And so pretty quickly you're going to see an impact in the inflation numbers, which does impact the ability of employees to put food on the table for their families. And so yeah, that does need to be addressed somewhat. So there was one case where we had designed a special measures policy for a client that defined devaluation and inflation events separately. But if there was a devaluation event, it was a one-time thing, which was then expected to be measured in terms of how inflation was impacted going forward. So the idea was, well, yeah, if there's a maxi devaluation, it's pretty likely that there's going to be high inflation that follows. So you want to get in front of that. But we're not going to continuously monitor the devaluation. At that point, we're going to start focusing more on the inflation numbers, even if they're going to be a little bit delayed coming in. Again, the advantage of that is acting first and not having to catch up.
Right.
You know, I think we talk a lot about economic situations, but I think it's also important to think about some of the natural disasters. And I'm not even going to go into pandemics because it's just, we've talked so much about pandemics this year. But you know, think about a typhoon flooding a village and washing away an employee's house, which is not uncommon. And that employee comes to the employer and says, hey, my house was totally washed away. I have no place to live. I lost all my stuff. My family and I are homeless. What can you do for me? Will you help me rebuild my house? You know, you want to say yes to that, but should you say yes? Keeping in mind that there are going to be others who are going to be helping similarly situated individuals. I mean, the Red Cross is going to be there. The international community is going to be there. The local community is going to be there. There's going to be all kinds of government assistance. It's going to take time to rebuild those houses. What is the business reason why you should help? And the business reason you should help is, well, these are your employees. You need them to run your business. If they can't come to work, if they have no place to live, they can't come to work. So yeah, there's something to be said for helping them, but you want to do it in a way that's not going to break the budget, that's going to be fair and equitable and sensible from a business perspective. It's going to be precedent setting. So if you do it in one country and it happens again somewhere else, they're going to know about it. So that's why we think the most important value you get from having one of these policies is that you have a conversation in advance about, well, this is what we're going to do if this happens. If we're not able to open the business in this country for a month because of the flood, are we going to pay our staff? Even though
So would you not agree that having that list of resources ahead of time and being proactive, you know, having that list of home builders or governmental assistance programs, so that if that incident occurs, that you can help connect those in need with those resources?
And also you can, instead of giving employees individual money, you can make donations to the community organizations that are helping.
Right.
So yeah, it's
Yeah.
very
So for
useful.
example, I just went out this past weekend with Project Angel Heart, which one major healthcare system donates to for those in need. So it delivers food and necessities to people's homes, and then has a team that on a weekly basis delivers those in need. So therefore, if any of their employees would find themselves in those situations, then those resources can be allocated. But it's an ongoing community effort.
Absolutely good example, Shar.
You I come back to the example where you can't open your business. Think of the Arab Spring in Cairo, when the streets of Cairo were filled with protesters some years ago and businesses couldn't operate. Do you have a policy that states if you can't operate, if you can't come to the office because the office can't open, do you still get paid? Maybe. For how long? You should have rules for this.
Mhm.
And another example is sometimes the local health insurance, which is typically provided by government Social Security programs, might not cover injuries related to natural disasters, or might have very low limits in terms of what's needed. Are you going to evacuate people
Mhm.
who need care in a neighboring country at considerable expense? Is that going to apply to everybody or just certain people?
Yeah.
These are very, very tough questions. And if you get a question like this in the heat of the moment when it's actually happening and you haven't thought about it before, it's really, really tough.
That's right. Well, as we are approaching the top of the hour, so I do want to take a break here really quick so we can announce identify our sponsor here. And as everybody has joined our previous forums, the TMA method is a company that continues to support the People Strategy Forum through, and the TMA method has a platform that does employee assessments, and so you can give your employee assessments or your candidates as they're coming into the company to understand what their talents and drives are, what motivates them, what kind of work that they find that is most satisfying for them, their innate talents and so forth. And you can use these assessments as a communication platform or a way to get to know your employees better and develop them and put them in the right job that most fits their talents. So
And I wanted to mention that today, Sam, just so you know, I'm meeting with about 3 of my employees today, and I'm utilizing the TMA, and we're really talking about a current status of how they're doing this year. And this has really replaced our entire traditional performance management program, and is more of a positive, uplifting communication tool. And my employees absolutely love it. So I just want to sponsor that. Mhm.
So glad to hear that, Shar. Yeah, it's more about having those positive conversations that actually to retain your top talent and help your people develop. So a great tool. I also want to recognize that there's some free apps here to explore the TMA method, and you can just go out and to your app store and look up TMA, and you'll be able to see a few apps there that you can use for hiring and individual coaching and so forth. But I do want to announce our next week's speaker. And as I mentioned, last week we had an internet interruption, and we were supposed to hear Patty Money speak. So we've rescheduled her for next week, and she's going to talk about the hybrid workforce. And there's a lot of things that comes into play here that we have to consider as we briefly discussed here with Howard. That having remote employees is not just as easy as having them remote. There's a lot of things you have to think about in that particular situation. All right, so as we come back to you, Warren, I know we do have a few questions. So Jules, do you see some questions that you want to bring up?
Yeah. But this is just to take it back to the salary discussion that we kind of were talking about a little earlier. So the question is, in which circumstances do you use the CPI in terms of collecting salary market data, and what are the pros and cons of the method?
So when we collect data for our salary surveys, we don't use CPI at all. We actually collect what our employers actually paying. And we think that that's really the best way to do it. We update our surveys 3 times a year, and so we have the ability to look at it on a longitudinal basis and measure small market movement from quarter to quarter, or from publication cycle to cycle. They're not really quarters. Where we would look at CPI data is during a crisis. So if there's a high inflation situation, 40, 50%, then we would monitor the situation on an ongoing basis for the next 6 to 12 months and use that together with actual survey data that's collected on a periodic basis to guide future adjustments. But generally speaking, we don't find that CPI data is a reliable source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For our listeners out there, CPI is a consumer price index, and it's an index of inflation. And part of I think you briefly touched on this during the conversation, Warren, about the cost of living versus cost of labor. So CPI factors into the cost of living, right?
And one of the real challenges with using cost of living data is that you have to assume a standard of living. And let me give you a simple example. I'm a single person living in the city, and I'm in a job, the same exact job as my colleague who's a married person living in the suburbs with a wife and 2 children. Should I get paid more because my rent is higher? Should he get paid more because he has children? The answer is we should be paid based on the characteristics of the job that we're doing and how well we perform in the job and how well qualified we are for the job and how I choose to spend my money. As the single person, I choose to spend it on more rent, living, in a nice new building in the city. As a family person, I'm choosing to live in the suburbs and provide a better schools, maybe better schools for my kids. Those are all personal choices that employees make every single day. And my advice is, as an employer, you should butt out. Let employees decide on their own standard of living and don't try to figure it out for them.
Yeah. One other thing I would add is that the cost of living or the CPI is something that can be fairly erratic at any particular time. You have an oil embargo and CPI jumps up. I mean, because it's driven a lot by energy and so forth. So it can jump up and have these spikes. But overall, the growth rate of CPI, especially in the United States, is relatively, or inflation is relatively low. And you'd see that the growth rate of jobs or labor is actually grows at a faster rate. So if you look at the CPI, you'd actually be increasing if your pay policy at a lower rate than the market is actually experiencing. Now, the other thing I would also say is that by focusing on the cost of labor, you're not ignoring inflation. Inflation is built in the cost of labor. It's just a lagging factor. So for instance, you'll have a spike and the CPI or inflation, and the next year or the following year that will start moving into the cost of labor because of course those individuals need to respond to the marketplace. But the fortunate thing about tracking the cost of labor is it's not so subjective to the ups and downs or the spikes as inflation is. So that was a great question, though. Any other questions that we have there, Jules?
Nope, looking pretty quiet on this side. So if anyone has anything that came up for them last minute, or even if you just want to leave a comment for Warren, that would be really great too. But yeah, for now, no. So you guys we can jump back into it.
Great. Well, I think I really appreciate your sharing us those thoughts of how to respond to these crises. I think that a lot of our listeners out there are thinking of ways to create a strategic advantage for their workforce, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can do that through your talent development, which you spend a lot of time talking about. There's also these plans where we can differentiate ourselves from our competitors by being more talent centric, thinking about taking care of our people when crisis happens. And one thing that I want to point out as a compensation expert, we want to establish pay so people don't have to worry about their pay. They can think about performing in their role. They can think about doing their best work. Well, that's the same thing when it comes to, as Warren mentioned, you lose your house, or you don't know when your next meal is, or if your child can go to school. Those are things that are basic needs that need to be satisfied so that our employees can do their best work. So this is a core need that should be thought about by a lot of companies. So if you're looking to be a talent differentiator, look into these programs. They're critical just as much as creating a base pay policy. Right. Well, thank you, Warren, once
Well
again
said.
for your
Thank you.
expertise. It's always been a pleasure, and thank you for being such a resource of knowledge that we can always go to.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I was very happy to participate, and I look forward to participating again sometime.
All right,
Very
great.
refreshing. Thank you, Warren. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Bye.
great week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.